think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
In this episode, once again, I will continue to read journal entries, which mostly focus on negative deities which I perceived, asked my spirits about, and even confronted firsthand while invoked. February 9th, 2015. Last night, when I was microdosed and invoking, I turned to find that my lighter was on fire. I quickly blew out the fire and dropped it in a jar of water, just in case. I noticed that part of the lighter mechanism had been removed from the rest of the lighter. Now, I've been using lighters to smoke marijuana since 1998, and I have never experienced a lighter undergoing spontaneous combustion. When I asked my guide about it, he said that it was a sort of attack by forces which are opposed to what I'm doing magically and want to discourage me from continuing. I've already mentioned hearing strange things when I'm in this state, most often coming through the bathroom's air vent. My guide says that these things are also attacks meant to frighten and dishearten me. I'll hear things in the air vents like an angry man yelling, people having rough sex, something which sounded like some sort of cat-human hybrid calling out to me, and various incidents of people arguing with each other. Here are some samples I wrote down of things I've heard people yelling in the air vents. Do you really think that you can make 30 years up? You know I don't like it when you do that. You know that! Contractually, I can't write you up, but Cheryl, I only hear these intense things while invoking, otherwise it's just normal bathroom conversations from my neighbors. Those normal conversations also sound much quieter. The voices I've heard in these little hauntings are often in different accents, and I don't think that my neighbors move in and out every day. Outside, I'll hear the now usual shrieks, howls, and terrible shouting that tends to occur when I microdose and invoke. Normally, when I'm not invoked, I just hear the occasional maintenance worker on a walkie, a child laughing, or a couple talking as they leave their car. But when I'm in a magical state, it's a goddamned madhouse out there. My guide urges me not to look out the window. February 25th, 2015. I mentioned my fly problem already, and the other day, at the height of microdosing, I was suddenly compelled to get up, centered myself in X, Y, and Z space, a quick form of the invoking ritual of the pentagram, yelled extremely loudly, "Beelzebub, you are banished!" twice while crushing a paper clip into a ball and then throwing it violently to the ground. Since then, I haven't seen a single fly, even while changing my cat's litter box. My guide says that I did dispel an attack by a force which could be compared mythologically to Beelzebub, the Lord of Flies. The never-ending assault of those flies was apparently a black magic attack on me by a malevolent god which represents filth, disgust, and disease-carrying pests. Their maggots and eggs would show up in the most repulsive and horrifying places. So horrible that I'll spare you the details. It's really bad. His parallel in the Elder Scrolls pantheon would be Nemira, the goddess of ugliness and filth. As far as the extractions are concerned, they've become so violent that I throw up in the act of coughing them out. Last night, I was enduring extraction after extraction in front of the kitchen sink, throwing up occasionally, and I noticed that the sink was suddenly filled with an iridescent orange goo. And I can guarantee that it wasn't my vomit, which was clear, being just water and white wine. I cleaned it out of the sink, and then just a little bit later, the sink was filled with it again. My guide says that it wasn't my vomit, but was something else that was being extracted from my body in a very different spiritual way. That's something I just can't figure out, though it does remind me of certain shamanic cleansing exercises. Very weird. March 31st, 2015. This morning when I was in the bathroom, a big old wasp buzzed over my head and I killed it with a spray cleaner. I was a bit confused how a wasp got into my apartment and all the way into the bathroom without me noticing it. My guide told me that it was not a normal event and was an attack last night by forces that don't like what I'm doing with magic and microdosing each night. I haven't experienced a single fly in here since doing the Beelzebub banishing after my place had been swarming with them. My guide says that the wasp was put there by another antagonistic force, something more associated with wasps than flies. Great. Well, I'll be checking the toilet each night before sitting down. April 11th, 2015. An interesting and unexpected benefit of my communication with my spirit guide has recently come up. I like to make music compilations, as I am fascinated with how songs can flow into each other and work together as a whole. But sometimes I won't remember exactly how a certain song goes, or how it begins and ends, and my guide has begun helping me with this. Oftentimes his choices don't make any sense to me when I'm putting the compilation together, but he has not let me down yet. His choices have astonished me when I listen to the compilations he puts together. He's even arranged compilations of songs I've only heard once or haven't even heard at all, and they still completely work in an amazing way. And this is just awesome because it's like I can get compilations of music that were like made by me for me, but I don't remember making them, and so many times the songs in them will be very new to me. Alright, April 12th, 2015. In my own workings, I have identified and given names to forces that I consider to be the enemy, at least for the work I want to be doing for the world, including a lot of characters that are of these nasty gods but are of a lower caste of sorts. The big ones I've identified I call, the Dominator, I associate with Moloch, Moloch Baal, Morgoth, and Ahriman. Parallels: patriarchal dominator culture, misogyny, rape, corporate corruption, politicians, ruined and dead cities, hopelessness, the dying old man at the top of the world, the true ruler of this planet, physical reality. And then the End, I associate with Set and Sithis. Parallels: murder most foul, the obliteration of all life, cloying black oil or sludge, living clouds of furious blackness, the smoke monster in Lost, the nothing in the never-ending story. It's also been pointed out to me that fossil fuels seem to be involved with this terrible being. The Adversary, I associate with Satan and Clavicus Vile. Parallels: the old devil at the crossroads, the Faustian tempter and betrayer, mafia boss mentality, take whatever you want, when you want it, from whoever you want it from mentality, Machiavellian plotting, the devil in the story of Christ in the desert. This bit from a Jason Louv article I'm reading particularly struck me in light of this. I'm quoting him here. Satan, the reverse of fire in the Archangel Michael, is a loathsome simian creature, the archetypal monkey on the back, whispering words which produce addiction to despair in all its permutations. Belial, the reverse of water in the Archangel Gabriel, is corruption incarnate, a thick, black astral slime which infects the planet, pollution, filth, disease. A black miasma proceeding from physical manifestations such as chemical spills into Belial's screaming face astrally condensed deep within the earth, vomiting forth black slime to corrode the world. An aside here, this reminds me of something which Stanislav Grof said when he was relating his experiences on large amounts of ketamine. He said that fossil fuels and all the chemicals we make from them are of dead material, and the power or essence of a god of negative death is present within them. He called it Plutonian or Pluto energy. Next, Leviathan. The reverse of Earth in the Archangel Uriel is the hateful and hurtful aspect of physicality itself, all the oppression inherent in being physically incarnate, all that which is struggled against in the process of day-to-day survival. It was astrally perceived as expanses of broken concrete buildings, pavement cracked by writhing larvae, and worms erupting from the earth. I can't help but notice parallels here between the Adversary and what he calls Satan, the End and what he calls Belial, and the Dominator and what he calls Leviathan. Now this little excerpt from Crowley really struck me in light of this. Quote, "The four eyes of the double-headed one, that are the four devils, Satan, Lucifer, Leviathan, Belial, that are the great princes of the evil of the world. Satan is worshipped by men under the name of Jesus, and Lucifer is worshipped by men under the name of Brahma, and Leviathan is worshipped by men under the name of Allah, and Belial is worshipped by men under the name of Buddha." Aleister Crowley, The Cry of the Third Aether, in Liber 418. And it just got me thinking, I don't know. Leviathan equals Dominator equals Allah equals male oppression, the patriarchy. Belial equals the End equals Buddha equals attaining nothingness, the end of all life. Satan equals the Adversary equals Jesus equals Christian hatred and judgment, wrath. Hey, I'm not saying that Brahma, Buddha, Jesus, and Allah are always of a negative spiritual nature, but just, well, never worship anything. There is a big difference between respecting a deity, working with them, and worshiping and praising them. And I've made it clear to the beings and deities I work with that I do not worship, but I do show them regard, respect, and honor. I think that as soon as you start worshiping something, you shift it into a negative aspect. In a future post, I'll describe some of the pantheon of nasties of a lower caste. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
In October 1901, stones were falling on Harrisonville, Ohio, as reported here in the Buffalo Express of 27th October 1901. The little village of Harrisonville, 8 miles from the city, is terribly wrought up over the mysterious stoning of houses and people there in broad daylight. It began on Sunday afternoon, October 13th, when a small boulder came crashing through the window of Zach Dye's house, a half-mile out of town. The family were all at home and at once ran out to see who had thrown the stone, but no one could be found. notwithstanding the house stands in the open and several hundred yards from any object large enough for a man to hide behind. While the members stood about in the yard in open-mouthed wonder, other stones pelted the house, coming from where no one knows. On Monday afternoon, at about the same hour, a shower of stones fell right in the heart of the little village. The first intimation the citizens had of it was when a piece of rock came through the plate glass door of a store, and when the proprietor and the customers ran outside to see who had thrown it, there was no one in sight. An alarm was given, and the citizens came out with their guns, and notwithstanding the stones continued to fall about them, they were unable to tell whence they came. One man, William Alkier, was hit a glancing blow in the arm, but was not seriously injured, while James Clay, a one-legged man, who was standing in front of his house shouting to the excited populace that it was probably nothing more than a lot of mischievous boys, had his crutch knocked out from under him and broken by a large boulder, which struck it about midway. On the third day, when the stones began to fly through the air, the entire population thronged the streets. They were lined up and counted to see who it could be that was throwing the stones. Every man and boy in the village was found to be in the line, and still the dangerous missiles flew through the air. By having all the male population in view, these resourceful villagers proved that the stone throwing was not a local prank, though presumably they thought a female could not be capable of such a thing. That it had poltergeist origins is suggested by the incident of James Clay's broken crutch, which is an example of the mischievous humor typical of poltergeists. 2 years later, in September 1903, an equally puzzling yet different type of stone-throwing poltergeist briefly afflicted W.G. Grotendieck, who was living at Dordrecht in the Sumatran jungle in Indonesia. He wrote, "At about 1 o'clock at night, I half awoke, hearing something fall near my head outside the mosquito curtain on the floor. After a couple of minutes, I completely awoke and turned my head half round to see what was falling on the floor. They were black stones from 1/8 to 3/4 of an inch long. I got out of the curtain and turned up the kerosene lamp that was standing on the floor at the foot of the bed. I saw then that the stones were falling through the roof in a parabolic line. They fell on the floor close to my head pillow. I went out and awoke the boy, a Malay Palambang coolie, who was sleeping on the floor in the next room. I told him to go outside and examine the jungle up to a certain distance. He did so whilst I lighted up the jungle a little by means of a small ever-ready electric lantern. At the same time that my boy was outside, the stones did not stop falling. My boy came in again, and I told him to search the kitchen to see if anybody could be there. He went to the kitchen, and I went inside the room again to watch the stones falling down. I knelt down near the head of my bed and tried to catch the stones while they were falling through the air towards me, but I could never catch them. It seemed to me that they changed direction in the air as soon as I tried to get a hold of them. I could not catch any of them before they fell on the floor. Then I climbed up the partition wall between my room and the boys and examined the roof just above it from which the stones were flying. They came right in through the cadjang, but there were no holes in the cadjang. When I tried to catch them there at the very spot of coming out, I also failed. He added that he could see the boy standing in front of him while stones fell behind. Also, the stones were hotter than could be explained by their having been kept in the hand or pocket for some time. They fell rather slowly. It seemed to me that they were hovering through the air. They described a parabolic curve and then came down with a bang on the floor. The sound they made in falling down on the floor was also abnormal because, considering their slow motion, the bang was much too loud. An incident of stone throwing occurred at a house in Marcinelle near Charleroi in Belgium. When the stone throwing was first reported on the 30th of January 1913, the police began to watch the house. One of the watchers said, "I have seen a stone arriving in the middle of a large window pane, and then came others in spiral round the first point of impact, so that the whole of the glass was broken up methodically. I even saw, in another window, a projectile caught in the fragments of glass of the first hole it made, and subsequently ejected by another passing through the same point." In other words, the aim of the unseen assailant was extraordinarily accurate. Mr. Van Zanten, who lived in the house, commented, "But what surprised us most was that not one of the 300 stones thrown hit anybody. The first day my little boy was in the garden and my little girl was sleeping in her cradle, near an open window on the first floor. They were not disturbed in any way. The nurse, it is true, was struck on the head by a piece of brick, but she was not much hurt. My father-in-law was hit on the arm and cried, 'Well, I did not feel anything.'" This next event occurred at Mount Vernon, Missouri, in July 1983, and it happened to Ron and Paula Watson. It was morning on the Watson farm. Looking across the road, the Watsons noticed some bright silver flashes coming from the pasture across from their farmhouse. Through binoculars, which Ron and Paula passed back and forth, a strange scene came into focus. There were two silver-suited beings running their hands over a motionless black cow lying on the ground. When the beings made jerky movements with their hands, the cow suddenly rose into the air and, with the beings, floated up into a cone-shaped object that stood near a clump of trees. Because the object's mirror-like surface reflected its surroundings, it was nearly invisible. Standing next to the object were two other strange-looking creatures. On the left side was a tall, green-skinned lizard man. Its glaring eyes had the vertical pupils of a reptile. Its hands and feet were webbed. On the right side of the craft was a taller Bigfoot-type creature that also had yellow vertical slits and round green eyes. Though Ron wanted to get closer, Paula pleaded with him not to cross the road. Later, under hypnosis, Paula revealed that she had been abducted by these beings just a few days before this incident. When the beings entered the object with the cow, the object disappeared. Later, the owner of the pasture told the Watsons that one of his black cows was missing. When the Watsons began to recount their experience, the farmer refused to listen. His black cow was never found. In Shirley, Massachusetts, a Middlesex County resident says he saw a transparent bipedal creature he was unable to identify. John, from Shirley, Massachusetts, told Cryptozoology News he and his wife were driving on Squannacook Road when they encountered the two-legged being. Quote, "We were returning from a Christmas party a few years ago," he said. "It was about 11 p.m. We were driving approximately 10 miles per hour down a dark road near our home. I focused on something that appeared to be walking across the road." John described it as an 8-foot-tall creature with a large head and completely transparent, resembling standing water. Its head was larger than a human's. It walked from the right side of the road to just about the middle of it. I remember about 45 minutes later I was letting my dog out, and I instantly smelled a foul odor that was similar to sulfur. He started jumping at something in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. Just had a feeling of high static electricity. In San Diego, California, a woman released a photograph this week she claims contains two entities. The woman, who provided a full name but was omitted in the report, said she was taking pictures in her San Diego home when she felt being watched. Quote, "I was in my family room taking pictures of the television of the wedding of William and Kate," she said about the 2011 event. "I felt that I had eyes on me." The images, reportedly taken with a Canon PowerShot SD750 camera, show the reflection of the staircase on a mirror. There seem to be two humanoid silhouettes that caught the homeowner's attention. "I noticed the reflection in the photo about a week after taking the photo. It looked blurry, but then I saw what clearly looked like something out of this world. I downloaded it to my computer and zoomed in. Everyone that has seen this photo says this thing sitting on the landing in my home looks like an alien." The owner of the house goes on to say that strange occurrences have been taking place in the residence since 1997, but did not elaborate any further. She claims to be horrified by the presence of these things and decided to rent the house. But, she says, the family currently staying there are also seeing unexplainable things. Their daughter has seen and complained of seeing strange beings in the house and would not want to sleep alone, she said. In Jasper, Tennessee, multiple people claim to have seen an unknown 4-legged creature with a human-like face. Brady, who provided the last name but was omitted for privacy purposes, said he was walking with 3 other people just behind their property in Marion County when they spotted the creature the night of July 31st. Quote, "We were on this trail on a wooded area close to a field," the eyewitness told Thomas Markham. Brady described the creature as a short but fairly large and wide animal with a hairy body and a human-like face coming towards them. "Its face was round and had little hair on it," she said. "It matches the description from the cave sightings," said Brady. There was no photographic evidence provided by the eyewitness. The sighting allegedly lasted about 10 seconds, and Brady did not specify what the creature, reportedly walking towards them, did next. In 2015, a 4-foot-long 4-legged creature with a hairless human face that looked like a miniature Bigfoot was reportedly seen by a woman in a cave of Hamblin County, Tennessee. She also claimed that inside the cave she found what appears to be a 16th century document written in Old Germanic, Amerigo Vespucci. Markham, who says he has been investigating the paranormal for over 20 years, also featured 2 YouTube videos with a follow-up investigation containing more images of the cave in the allegedly found document. He believes the new sighting could add new information to the possibility of the reappearance of the extinct giant ground sloth. The Megatherium was an elephant-sized sloth native to South America, believed to have disappeared by the end of the Pleistocene. Quote, "Some may not know that sloth bones were discovered close to the location of the cave," said Markham. "It could be possible that these creatures moved into the large cave systems found in Kentucky and Tennessee." On September 27, 1954, at 0840 hours, in Figeac, France, children saw a box and an unknown man standing nearby. The object took off. On September 27, 1954, in the afternoon, in Perpignan, France, a college student saw a circular object on the ground. 2 beings came out of it, then re-entered the craft and left, witness in a state of shock. On September 27, 1954, at 2030 hours, in Prémenon, France, 4 children came out of their home as a dog barked furiously. They found a large object on the ground and a small being they thought was a ghost on the yard. Raymond Romand, 12, threw stones at the intruder. On September 28, 1954, at 2130 hours, in Francois, France, Mr. and Mrs. Alexis Lartilot and Georgette Mongeau observed a large, bright object oscillate, then land. It changed color and was lost to sight behind some trees. September 28, 1954, at 2230 hours, in Bouzaille, France, at Les Grands Tertres, Mr. Musset observed that someone had stolen grapes from his vineyard. He decided to stay late and catch the robbers. He was amazed when he saw a luminous mass fall from the sky about 50 meters away and found himself paralyzed as 3 figures emerged from the light and moved about. He lost consciousness. When he came to his senses, everything had vanished. On September 28, 1954, at 23:10 hours, at Saint-Nicolas-de-Redon, France, at La Butte Rouge, 2 railroad engineers, Bernard and Poutreau, who were bringing a locomotive from Nantes to Auray, saw a dark object take off with a purple glow and follow them for 15 seconds before veering off. Poutreau had to see a doctor. Now some strange events from France. In Ceyron, mysterious fires in farmhouse, about 90 in 1 month, began 6 August 1979. In Seyssel, near Lyon, poltergeist outbreak, 2 weeks in early 1930s. In Trons-in-Provence, M. Collini watched UFO land at the bottom of his garden at 5 p.m. A minute later it took off, and landing traces were found. Scientific study undertaken, 8th February 1981. In Uzès, teenager at home at night saw and photographed bright shining ball on the road, 19th November 1974. In Valençon, Maurice Moss saw UFO land in his lavender field and was immobilized by 2 4-foot entities who pointed an instrument at him, 1st July 1965. In Villasang-Puy-de-Dôme, noises heard from lake after nightfall gave rise to rumors of monster in lake, 1929. In Zoldabu, poltergeist outbreak including bells ringing, pictures moving, and objects placed in the beds, 7th of September to 24th of September, and then 17th of December to 18th of December 1914. Now going to Gabon, in Libreville, fishermen saw UFO land from which strange entity emerged, which made incomprehensible noises before returning to UFO and taking off. It left footprints in sand, 25th December 1963. Now going to the Gambia, at Bungalow Beach, carcass of strange sea creature washed ashore, possibly a long extinct species, June 1983. In Gibraltar, North Front, thousands of small frogs fell during a thunderstorm, May 1921. Now going to Greece, in the Astorousia Mountains, in Crete, 3 youngsters out hunting saw a giant dark gray bird flying low. It had bat-like wings with finger-like projections, sharp claws, pelican's beak, and reminded them of a pterodactyl, summer 1986. At Cape Matapan, ship's crew saw a sea monster with long neck and humps, spring 1912. In Missolonghi, poltergeist outbreak, December 1926 to January 1927. In Navplion, thousands of little green frogs fell in the rain, 1981. In Thasos, man in boat saw periscope 5 to 6 feet out of water and moving fast, too fast for a submarine, may have been a sea monster, May or June 1916.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
April 13th, 2015. Here is a list of the lesser nasty forces I've identified and given my own names to. Now, I gotta say, since writing this, I actually have integrated some of these, and they are now allies of mine, so oftentimes I've even changed the name. Okay, first one, matriarchs. The old hag, Victorian gloom, crows and ravens, the Earth Mother in reverse, negative witchcraft, the bride of the dominator, Babylon, infected by other gods from within, atavistic magic, Austin Osman Spare, Marjorie Cameron, a dark medieval Victorian astral city I call Crucible. In her friendly aspect, she appears as a starkly beautiful, gothy, witchy, middle-aged woman with white skin, black hair, and clothes. Or actually, young woman, now I noticed. And in her attack aspect, she is the most wretched and ugly old hag wearing no clothes and constantly screaming. Okay, the next one, Brundini, the artificial man, Frankenstein's monster, automatons, boxhead, the one with no soul, Solomon Grundy from Batman. His appearance is large, ugly, horrifying, and pity-inducing. It's like the fake man. The warlord, warmongering, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Hitler, the United States military-industrial complex, Talos from the Elder Scrolls, the Pentagon, military officers. The more removed from the actual battlefield, the better. This doesn't count soldiers and enlisted. Any U.S. president in recent years. He resembles an older man in a formal uniform presented in a grand portrait. Next one, Black Cinder. I know nothing at this point about the Black Cinder other than that he has something to do with the Desert of Ash, which is a terrible astral plane, and that his face is permanently fused together with a death mask of sorts. Next one, Alien Spider Bitch. Associated with Kali, Mafala from Elder Scrolls, feeding off of others. Collections of severed body parts. She is indescribably terrible to look at. Next one, The Clown. Destructive chaos. The Joker from Batman. Screwing things up for the sake of screwing things up. Very strong presence in Indian spirituality, though I haven't identified the correspondent deity or deities in the Hindu pantheon. His face is a rictus grin that pierces deep into the soul. Next one, The Spook. Nightmares, omens, fear. But not panic, which is someone else. Horror movies. Amusement park haunted houses. Spookiness. Hauntings meant to cause fear. lidless eyes and lipless teeth and a visage of terrifying countenance when in attack mode, and an attractive young man resembling Johnny Depp with a white suit and white skin and white hair and no sense of humor when in friendly mode. He is someone I directly saw, and I gotta say he's one of the ones who I've integrated since, and he is an ally. Okay, the next one. The Abominate. The Charon-Zon. The Typhoon. Lord of the Abyss. Hermaeus Mora from Elder Scrolls. The Gatekeeper to Klepothic Space. Demented and unnatural things done in science, technology, magic, and art. Monstrous ego. Completely inhuman things from beyond. A galaxy that has collapsed and refuses to die. Subconscious inspiration of Lovecraftian monsters. Resembles a never-ending whirlwind of chaos and torment. Sometimes resembles inhuman things like tentacles and claws. The next one, the Kitsch. Things done badly. All things tacky and tasteless. John Waters is a saint of this guy, though I love John Waters. A lot of his work is great. Tim and Eric would also be saints of the Kitsch. One time he appeared as a severed John Waters head on 2 ostrich legs with a ridiculously long tongue lolling out, bounding around my apartment like a nutcase. Another time he appeared as a horrible visage which I can only describe as a plastic human head with the face removed and the internal parts all jumbled up. Kind of like a defiled mannequin. Terrible to look at. Now the next one, Ultra, in all capital letters. The power and glory of torture. God of most serial killers. The pure energy of violent domination. Bob in Twin Peaks. I see no face with this one. Just white-hot energy. It's like a white-hot light of glory and power. It's really on no one's side, and actually can be used as a tool for positivity. Next one, the Hooded Killer. I have no idea at this point. All I have is a name. Next one, the Filth. Beelzebub. All things disgusting and repulsive. There are cults in India dedicated to this one. Namira in Elder Scrolls. Flies and maggots. Resembles a man in a suit with a bloody skeleton face and long hair. And that's when he's in friendly mode. In unfriendly mode, just, ugh, no. Next one, the Behemoth. Gluttony, be it physical, spiritual, or psychological. Resembles a massive anthropomorphic elephant man. Next one, Mammon. Greed. I have no face for this one. Next one, the Hierophant. Organized religion. The Pope, Jehovah, has an extended skull. He has corrupted Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, away from their original, true, useful, meaningful roots of Gnosticism, Kabbalism, and Sufism. Next one, the Meditating Devil. A negative aspect of many shamanic, religious, and magical systems. Cult leaders, many yogis and wise men, gurus. Magical systems of brainwashing and control, manipulation and subjugation of others. Resembles a contemplative sage of Eastern mysticism. But don't let this make you think that I'm against all Eastern mystics, not at all. Alright, that's that rundown.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
I'm going to read a chapter from the book Supernatural by Graham Hancock. The chapter is called The Plant That Enables Men to See the Dead. I lay on a couch in the darkened drawing room of a 200-year-old townhouse in the English city of Bath. The streets outside were deserted and offered few clues to remind me of the familiar world. It was reassuring to find that I could still read the luminous dial of my wristwatch if I held it in front of my eyes. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 35. I began to feel bored, restless, even a little blasé. After 45 minutes, I closed my eyes and directed my thoughts inwards towards contemplation, still noticing nothing unusual. But at the end of the first hour of my vigil, when I tried to stand up and walk around, I was amazed to discover that my legs would not work. Out of nowhere, an enervating feebleness had ambushed my limbs. The slightest physical effort set off uncontrollable tremors and stumbling, and I had completely lost my sense of balance. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me, and I fell back exhausted on the couch, drenched in cold sweat. I remembered with a shudder of finality that I could not change my mind, because there was no antidote. Once it was underway, the process I was going through could not be stopped and would simply have to be endured. My hearing was the next faculty affected. At intervals, there would be a tremendous ringing and buzzing in my ears, blotting out all other sounds. My eyesight also rapidly deteriorated, soon becoming so obstructed at the edges with strange black lines, like fence posts or gratings, that I could no longer see my watch and had to abandon all control of time. For what felt like a very long while, the poison remorselessly tightened its grip, and I fell prey to indescribable sensations of physical and psychic unease. There was a great deal of pain, weakness, and discomfort. It was as if my body were being slowly and systematically smashed and dismembered, and I began to fear that I might never be able to put it back together again. In a moment of stillness when my eyes were closed, a vision popped up. A vivid, moving tapestry of intertwining branches and leaves, elaborate arabesques, and Celtic knotwork. I blinked my eyes open. Instantly, the writhing patterns vanished and the darkened drawing room returned. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the patterns came back. More unmeasured time passed while the patterns continued to expand and multiply. Then another great gust of dizziness hit me, and I winced at the terrifying new sensation it brought of balancing on a swaying tightrope over a bottomless abyss. I found that if I lay on my back, looked straight up at the ceiling, and stayed absolutely still, I could minimize these uncomfortable effects. But all it took was the slightest movement of my head to left or right to bring on another spectacular surge of vertigo. When at last I closed my eyes again, the sinuous, intertwined patterns reappeared with renewed intensity, and then were abruptly overwritten by a profile view of a heavily built, blond young man with his eyes turned towards me in a glare of reproach. He appeared right at my side, startlingly close. His skin was pallid, and his brow blotched with patches of green mold. Shamanic portals. In the Central African countries of Gabon, Cameroon, and Zaire, certain age-old ancestor cults still flourish in the 21st century. Their members share a common belief, based, they say, on direct experience, in the existence of a supernatural realm where the spirits of the dead may be contacted. Like some hypothetical dimension of quantum physics, this other world interpenetrates our own and yet cannot ordinarily be seen or verified by empirical tests. It is therefore a matter of great interest, with highly suggestive research implications, that tribal shamans claim to have mastered a means through the consumption of a poisonous shrub known locally as iboka or iboga, by which humans may reach the other world and return alive. How they mastered this skill is told in the origin myth of the indigenous secret society known as the Bwiri. Zame-Ye-Mebege, the last of the creator gods, gave us iboka. One day he saw the pygmy Bitamu high in an antonga tree, gathering its fruit. He made him fall. He died, and Zame brought his spirit to him. Zame cut off the little fingers and little toes of the cadaver of the pygmy and planted them in various parts of the forest. They grew into the iboka bush. The pygmy's wife was named Atanga. When she heard of the death of her husband, she went in search of his body. Eventually, after many adventures, she came to a cave in the heart of the forest in which she saw a pile of human bones. As she entered the cave, she suddenly heard a voice, as of the voice of her husband, asking who she was, where she came from, and whom she wished to speak with. The voice told her to look to the left at the mouth of the cave. There was the iboka plant. The voice told her to eat its roots. She ate and felt very tired. Then she was told to turn around in the cave. The bones were gone, and in their place stood her husband and other dead relatives. They talked to her and gave her a new name, Dusomba, and told her that she had found the plant that would enable men to see the dead. This was the first baptism into Bwiri, and that was how men got the power to know the dead and have their counsel. Today, several million people distributed across Gabon, Cameroon, and Zaire have no difficulty resisting well-financed efforts at conversion aimed at them by Christian and Islamic missionaries. Their allegiance instead is to the Bwiri, into which they have been initiated by consuming huge amounts of iboka root bark shavings and experiencing a journey into supernatural realms. Iboka, also known as iboga, the spelling that I will use from now on, is classified scientifically as Tabernanthe iboga and is a member of the Apocynaceae, or dogbane family. Its root bark turns out to be very special, as the myth of the pygmy asserts, and contains more than a dozen unusual chemicals belonging to a class known as the indole alkaloids. One of them, ibogaine, is the potent hallucinogen responsible for the convincing and life-changing visions experienced by Bwiri initiates, notably encounters with supernatural beings and encounters with the spirits of the dead. Many report meeting their deceased fathers or grandfathers who act as guides for them in the spirit world. However, the bark must be eaten in toxic quantities if the visionary state is to be attained, and initiates confront an ever-present risk of fatal overdose as they seek out their ancestors. Iboga root bark and ibogaine hydrochloride, the pure extract of the psychoactive alkaloid, are both illegal drugs in the United States. They are classed under Schedule 1 alongside other major hallucinogens such as LSD and addictive narcotics and stimulants like heroin and crack cocaine. By contrast, in Britain and several other European countries, where there is growing scientific recognition of a number of startling therapeutic effects claimed for ibogaine, the drug has not been banned. It may be purchased legally and openly from specialized botanical suppliers and consumed freely in any private place. Research. Even without the barbaric threat of a jail sentence, ibogaine is a very serious business, so I had not gone lightly into the decision that had led me to this couch, this night, in this state of helpless prostration to whatever was coming next. My primary motive, unabashedly, was research. I had deliberately submitted myself to this ordeal as part of a wider, longer-term investigation into a mysterious before and after moment that took place in human prehistory, perhaps as recently as 40,000 years ago. Before it, other than a very few widely scattered and isolated examples, there is nothing in the archaeological record left by our ancestors that we would instantly recognize as modern human behavior. After it, the signs that creatures exactly like us have arrived are everywhere. Most notably, in the first definite evidence for beliefs in supernatural realms and beings, evidence, in other words, for the birth of religion. The clearest possible illustration of this is in Southwest Europe, where sophisticated religious art, the oldest so far discovered in the world, appears suddenly, with no apparent antecedents, between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, and then endures until approximately 12,000 years ago. This is the art of the great painted caves such as Chauvet, Lascaux, Pechmerle, and Altamira, surely amongst the most beautiful and enigmatic of all human creations. The cave paintings are rightly famous for their realistic images of Ice Age mammals. Much less well known is the fact that numerous supernatural and chimerical beings, often half human, half animal, are also depicted. An ingenious explanation for the bizarre appearance of these beings, as well as for other intriguing features of the caves which we'll explore in later chapters, has been put forward by a prestigious international group of anthropologists and archaeologists. The essence of their argument is that the cave art expresses mankind's first and oldest notions of the supernatural, of the soul, and of realms of existence beyond death. Notions that took shape in altered states of consciousness, most likely brought on by the consumption of psychoactive plants. Although, not to the liking of some scholars, this has been the most widely accepted theory of cave art since the mid-1990s. It is therefore an embarrassment that none of the experts currently advocating it have ever actually consumed any psychoactive plants themselves, nor do they have any first-hand idea of what an altered state of consciousness is, or any desire to experience one. To give fair consideration to their arguments and to the views of their critics, I felt I needed to be able to judge on the basis of personal experience whether plant-induced visions could be made of strong enough stuff to have convinced early humans of the existence of supernatural realms and of the survival after death of some essence of deceased ancestors. This, in a nutshell, was why I had taken Ibogaine. For sound, solid, common-sense research reasons. But I have to acknowledge that there was another, much more personal motive as well. It had to do with my own father's painful death from bone cancer in the previous autumn and my inexcusable failure to be at his bedside during the last few days of his life. Part of the appeal of this slightly risky experiment with Ibogaine was undoubtedly its promise of encounters with the ancestors and, however tenuous, the possibility of closure and quietus that it seemed to offer. Long night of Iboga. I've probably given the impression up until now that I was alone during my vigil and bath, but this wasn't the case. The psychoactive dose of Ibogaine that I consumed was administered by an experienced and reputable healer who remained on hand the whole night. My wife Santha was also in the room, and we had a medical doctor present as well. At first, I'd been acutely aware of all three, but as the malaise and paralysis deepened, they faded into insignificance, and I seemed to see them, if at all, through panels of thick glass. The same odd disconnection applied to the bowl I'd been given to vomit in. I was able to hold onto it and retch over it, but I was in one place and it was in another. As the night wore on, I could feel my couch undergoing an insidious process of transformation, until eventually it had become a stone sarcophagus within which I was laid out. I experienced a strong sense of constriction and immobility, as though a great weight were pressing down on my chest, and wondered, is this death? At the same instant, the room became very full of people. Not the healer, my wife, and the doctor, who might as well have been locked away in a soundproof capsule, but a large and somehow threatening crowd of uninvited guests. They did not vanish when I opened my eyes, as my earlier visions had done, but stayed firmly in view, for the most part anonymous and shadowy, shoulders hunched, heads down. A few showed their faces, but like the young blonde man I'd seen earlier, with his mildewed skin, they had the look of the grave. I grew conscious that someone was watching me from far back in the jostling crowd. Lean and middle-aged, with a solemn manner, he was dark-skinned and his features were unmistakably African. His eyes were huge and black as obsidian. He was not old and gray, as was usually the case in the visions of the Bwiti, but the thought came to me that this might be the legendary spirit of Iboga, here to abduct my soul. Iboga is intimately associated with death. The plant is frequently anthropomorphized as a supernatural being, a genetic ancestor who can so highly value or despise an individual that it can carry him away to the land of the dead. I fell into a dream state for what seemed like a very long time, and as with most dreams, I now find it hard to remember the details. All I can confirm is my absolute certain conviction that something happened. Something of lasting importance to me. Did I hallucinate an encounter with my father? I don't remember clearly enough to be absolutely sure, but I get flashbacks of that night in which I see him amongst the crowd of phantoms gathered around me. Sometimes the flashbacks are so poignant and intense that I can almost believe he must really have been out there, walking by with dignity and pain as he did when he was fighting his cancer. As well as these tantalizing recollections of my father, I've managed to dredge up a few other broken images from those hours of fevered dreams, which add to my sense that something momentous occurred. At one point, I felt very strongly that I had awakened. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the familiar outlines of the darkened drawing room. Instead, I found myself in a very strange place that I had never seen before, with billowing draperies hanging from the walls, trees growing within, and a ceiling transparent to the stars. It seemed like some exotic temple, part sanctuary, part palace, part desert tent. To one side, absorbed in the motions of a dance, I could see a giant figure dressed in flowing white robes with black vertical marking. Was I dreaming or awake? Was what I was seeing real in some way, as it very convincingly seemed to be, or was it all just a grand illusion? And did the spirit of my father still survive in some other dimension or reality? These were weighty questions, not easily settled. But for now, at least, my interest was narrower. Plants like tabernanthe, iboga, were available to our ancestors and would have had the same effects on them as they do on us. I remembered the overwhelmingly eerie sense I had experienced for much of the night of crowds of the dead gathered around me, crowds of ghosts, crowds of my forebears. Of course, it was reasonable and potentially productive to ask whether it was not precisely experiences of this general sort that gave rise, in remote antiquity, to mankind's first notions of the spirit world. Since scholarship as yet has no complete or satisfactory explanation for the origins of religion, this is an area that remains ripe for investigation. Towards morning, with light beginning to filter through gaps in the curtains, I was not surprised to go through a mild out-of-body experience. These are common amongst Bwiti initiates under the influence of Iboga, and I wasn't completely new to the phenomenon myself. The last time it had happened to me was when I was 16 years old and was nearly killed by a massive electric shock. Now, as then, my consciousness seemed to float near the ceiling of the room for a few moments, looking down on my own body. Now, as then, I felt detachment and curiosity, certainly not fear, and reveled in the lightness of being and freedom of flight I seemed to be able to enjoy in the disembodied state. Now, as then, the hallucination, or whatever it was, rapidly faded and the out-of-body view was quickly lost. I was left with a philosophical reflection in the form of a cartoon image of a large sausage tightly knotted at one end. This is what we are, the image seemed to be saying. The message was obvious, almost a cliché, that it is pointless to dwell on the physical and material aspects of life because ultimately our bodies are just overstuffed sausage skins. Healing with spirits. For more than 12 hours after the visions ended, I remained violently ill and was unable to walk. It was not until the second night that my strength began to return, the muscle tremor stopped, and I recovered my sense of balance. By the following morning, I felt completely better and ravenously hungry, and went through a long, active day without any sense of fatigue. Iboga is a shamanic drug. In the Bwiti scheme of things, it brings healing in this world by reconnecting us to the world of spirits. My visions, I knew, had been relatively subdued and unspectacular by comparison with those of the Bwiti initiates, but I, too, in my own limited way, had experienced contact with some sort of other world through consumption of their sacred plant. Was it really a supernatural realm that the Ibogaine took me into, or just a crazy hallucination? As I've emphasized, this was not something I was yet in a position to judge, nor was it easy to disentangle cause from effect. But what was miraculous nonetheless was the dramatic turnaround in my mood that I benefited from after my Ibogaine session. For months beforehand, I had been intensely depressed and irritable, filled with morbid thoughts and gloomy anxiety. My guilt at what I perceived as my dismal failure of my father, and my grief at his loss, had been compounded by feelings of worthlessness and anguish so deep that I frequently saw no point in taking any further initiatives in life. It was better by far, I had persuaded myself, to withdraw from the world, abandon research, and avoid all new intellectual challenges, which, anyway, I would certainly fail. I hadn't expected Ibogaine to make a difference, but it did. From the moment I woke up with my strength recovered, I knew that it had flipped some sort of switch in me because I was no longer able to see anything in the world in the same negative and nihilistic way as I had done before. From time to time, a morbid thought would still stray across my mind and try to drag my mood down. Previously, I would have dwelt on it obsessively until it made me miserable. Now I found it easy to dismiss it and move on. I didn't feel so bad about my dad either. I'd not been at his bedside and I couldn't change that, but somehow now I no longer ached so much. Whether this healing was achieved through contact with the spirit world or whether it was just a beneficial side effect of shaking up my brain chemistry, I felt grateful to Ibogaine. Regardless of the explanation or the mechanism, it had put me through something I would never forget. Something very much like a religious experience. It had swept away the cobwebs of ingrained bad habits and moods, and it had most persuasively demonstrated the worth of a hitherto neglected line of research into the spiritual life of the ancients.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
I'm going to read a chapter from the book, The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings by John Keel. And this chapter is called The Grinning Man. A blazing white light, as big as a car, nearly scraped the 550-foot-tall television tower outside of Pompton Lakes, New Jersey, site of the large DuPont explosive factory on the night of October 11, 1966. A policeman and his wife watched the object move slowly northward and disappear beyond the neighboring hills. On the other side of those hills, Sergeant Benjamin Thompson and Patrolman Edward Wester of the Wanake Reservoir Police observed the same light at about 9:45 p.m. as it swooped low over the reservoir. The light was brilliantly white, Thompson said. It lit up the whole area for about 300 yards. In fact, it blinded me when I got out of the patrol car to look at it, and I couldn't see for about 20 minutes afterwards. 40 miles south of Wanake, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, two boys had a frightening experience that October 11th, at approximately the same time that officers Thompson and Wester were watching the glowing object cavort above the reservoir. There had been a number of aerial sightings in the vicinity of Elizabeth the previous week, apparently clustered around the New Jersey Turnpike, which slices through that city. New Jersey newspapers from one end of the state to the other were filled with UFO reports during that period. The two boys, James Yanchitis and Martin Mouse Munov, were walking home along 4th Street and New Jersey Street when they reached a corner parallel to the turnpike. The turnpike is elevated, and there is a very steep incline dipping down from the busy thoroughfare to 4th Street. A very high wire fence runs along the street, making it impossible for anyone to scramble up that incline to the turnpike. There are bright street lights on that particular corner. It was on this corner that the two young men encountered, quote, the strangest guy we've ever seen. Yanchita spotted him first. Quote, he was standing behind that fence, the youth said later. I don't know how he got there. He was the biggest man I ever saw. Jimmy nudged me, Mouse reported, and said, who's that guy standing behind you? I looked around and there he was, behind that fence, just standing there. He pivoted around and looked right at us, and then he grinned a big old grin. 3 days later, we visited Elizabeth, accompanied by UFO lecturer James Moseley and actor Chuck McCann. We interviewed the boys separately at length in the home of Mr. George Smythe, and they both told the same identical story. The man was over 6 feet tall, they agreed, and was dressed in a sparkling green coverall costume that shimmered and seemed to reflect the streetlights. There was a wide black belt around his waist. McCann, who was the star of his own TV series in New York, is a very large man, about 6 feet 2 inches tall, but both boys said the person they saw was bigger than McCann and much broader. He had a very dark complexion and little round eyes, real beady, set far apart. They could not remember seeing any hair, ears, or nose on this figure, nor did they notice his hands. He was standing in the underbrush behind the fence and his feet were out of sight. There had been some incidents of violence in the neighborhood, and the boys did not stop to study this strange character. They ran home. Later, there were rumors in the area that a tall green man had chased a middle-aged resident down the same street that same night. We were unable to track those rumors down. The big mystery seemed to be, how did this man get behind that fence and what was he doing there? We consider the possibility that it might have been a driver whose car or truck was in trouble on the turnpike overhead, but it seemed unlikely that he would have struggled down the very steep embankment and then just stood fixedly behind the fence. He certainly would have called to the boys and asked them to make a phone call for him or fetch help, but the boys seemed convinced that he was just quietly watching a house across the street. A giant grinning man stood behind a high fence on a street corner in Elizabeth, New Jersey on the night of a flap. It would be a UFO flap. It means a lot of UFOs at once. It hardly proved anything, but we have heard about the Grinning Man over and over again in our travels. A sewing machine salesman from Mineral Wells, West Virginia, Woodrow Derenberger, was driving home from Marietta, Ohio, on the rainy Wednesday night of November 2, 1966, when an object shaped like the chimney of a kerosene lamp dropped out of the sky and landed on the highway directly in front of the West Virginian's truck. Derenberger slammed on his brakes and stared in astonishment as a man emerged from the object and strolled towards him. He described the man as being about 6 feet tall with a dark complexion and slightly elongated eyes. He wore a dark coat and blue trousers, which were quite shiny and had a glistening effect. As the man neared the door of the truck, Derenberger heard a voice ask him to roll down his window. The man stepped up to the door with his arms crossed over his chest and his hands hidden under his armpits. He grinned fixedly at Derenberger, and his lips never moved, yet Derenberger distinctly heard a voice and conversed with this odd gentleman through mental telepathy. Their discussion was brief and rather pointless. The man said his name was Cold, and that he was from a country much less powerful than the United States. He asked Derenberger who he was, where he was going, and a few other simple questions. Then he said he would be back, returned to the object, and it flew off. Woodrow Derenberger, who had never read any UFO literature, thus entered the world of the contactees. A year later, he had divorced his wife after having changed jobs and addresses several times and having repeatedly changed his unlisted phone number. Finally, in December 1967, he fled to another state and hid for several months, during which time he married another contactee. We have interviewed Derenberger several times and have appeared on Long John Nebel's radio show with him. Gray Barker, publisher of Saucer News, accompanied us on our first trek to Mineral Wells, and that night we saw some small lights bobbing around in a field behind Woody's house. Being intrepid UFO investigators, we went into the field to take a closer look. Woody, unfortunately, had failed to tell us two things, both rather important. First, the fence around the field was electrified. We discovered this quickly enough and went sailing over it into a large mud puddle. Our sudden flight discouraged Gray from trying to climb the fence. A few minutes later, we learned that there was a very bad-tempered bull in that field. Our years as bullfighting aficionados in Spain came in handy. Instead of trying to outrun the bull, we stood our ground, flashed our flashlight in his unhappy face, and bluffed him long enough to stage a dignified retreat. We never did find out what those little lights were. Derenberger claimed they were being projected from Cold's ship somewhere overhead. According to his complicated story, injured Cold and his friends frequently visited the farm, often arriving by automobile for long, friendly chats. Innumerable witnesses did see strange unidentified objects throughout the area and quite frequently directly above Woody's house. The night of his first contact, 2 other men also reported identical incidents to the Parkersburg police. We eventually tracked them down and spoke to them. They were not from Parkersburg. They confirmed our information but said they did not want their names used. "We don't want to get involved," one of them said flatly. Woody, however, agreed to a press conference and appeared on radio and TV. The local NICAP subcommittee zeroed in on him, urging him to tell his story to no one but NICAP. He voluntarily submitted to an extensive physical and psychiatric examination arranged by NICAP. A leading local psychiatrist conducted the tests. Nightcap was nonplussed when the psychiatrist himself became a contactee a month later and now admits to both person-to-person confrontations and telepathic communications with the UFO entities. While he talks freely about these contacts and his claims conform to all of the patterns, he naturally does not want his name used. But he has talked anonymously on radio programs and backed Darren Berger to the hilt. There were many other contactees in the Ohio Valley area, most of whom were completely unknown to Woody. Only Darren Berger's story of November 2nd received any publicity. The wire services circulated it nationwide, but his later experiences are not even known to the hardcore ufologists. It is certainly startling when contactees hundreds of miles from West Virginia recite details identical to the things Woody had told us privately. Darren Berger is not a learned man. Indrid Cold and his funny companions told him they were from a planet called Lanulos, which was in the galaxy of Ganymedes. Actually, Ganymede is a large satellite of the planet Jupiter. Woody claims that he has been there and visited a number of cities where the people wear colorful shorts, and all signs, posters, etc. appear to be written in a squiggly Oriental-like writing. The air and the temperature are identical to Earth's. We stopped by to see Woody again in the spring of 1967 and found him hiding behind drawn curtains, trying to avoid the hundreds of UFO believers, skeptics, and the just plain curious who invaded his property every night and every weekend. 60 miles south of Parkersburg, in the little town of Point Pleasant, hundreds of people were quietly living in fear. About 7 miles north of the town, there is an expansive World War II ammunition dump known locally as the TNT area. This consists of several hundred wooded acres filled with concrete domes used to store explosives manufactured at nearby plants. Residents of this thinly populated sector have been seeing strange things in the sky and on the ground since the summer of 1966. One family in particular, Mr. and Mrs. James Lilly and their children, have had the full range of UFO activities around their home on Camp Conley Road, just south of the TNT area. They first began seeing low-flying luminous objects early in March 1967, but kept their sightings to themselves for several weeks. Mr. Lilly, a no-nonsense riverboat captain on the Ohio, was skeptical at first and tried to figure out a rational explanation. Quote, "It didn't take us long to learn that when our TV started acting up, it was a sure sign that one of those lights was passing over," Jim Lilly told us that April. "I didn't much think of all the flying saucer talk until I started seeing them myself. You've got to believe your own eyes." Automobiles in the vicinity of the Lilly home began to display an odd tendency to stall without cause. By mid-April, the word had leaked out that the Martians were visiting Camp Conley Road every night, and carloads of teenagers and adults swarmed over the area. Few were disappointed. Reporters, policemen, and Mason County Sheriff George Johnson were among the countless witnesses. "We've seen all kinds of things," Mrs. Lilly said. "Blue lights, green ones, red ones, things that change color. Some of them have been so low that we thought we could see diamond-shaped windows in them, and none of them make any noise at all." During our in-depth interview with all the members of the Lilly family, we uncovered a number of significant incidents which had seemed totally unrelated to UFOs. In the fall of 1966, the Lillys started hearing odd noises around their little ranch house. They did not discuss these things outside their family, but they wondered if their home had not suddenly become haunted. Kitchen cabinet doors slammed in the middle of the night. Mrs. Lilly heard sounds like a baby crying. "It sounded so plain," she said, "that I looked around the house even though I knew there was no baby here. It seemed to come from the living room, only a few feet away from me." Their daughter-in-law, Mrs. Doris Lilly, who lived in the south end of Point Pleasant, began to receive strange phone calls early in March 1967. Each evening around 5 p.m., her phone would ring, and when she answered, she heard only a bizarre metallic voice speaking in an incomprehensible language. It was guttural and rapid. These calls came only when she was alone. "It was as if they knew when I came home," she noted. The same thing happened night after night. Finally, she was afraid to stay alone in the little bungalow. The phone company examined her lines and could not explain the calls. Part of our investigative routine includes a discussion of the witness's dreams during the flat periods, and one of our carefully phrased key questions is, "Did you ever dream there was a stranger in the house in the middle of the night?" When we directed this question at the Lillys, Mrs. Lilly urged her quiet 16-year-old daughter Linda to tell about the nightmare she had had that March. Linda was reluctant to discuss it, but with a little coaching from the sidelines, she told how she woke up one night and saw a large figure towering over her bed. "It was a man," she said, "a big man, very broad. I couldn't see his face very well, but I could see that he was grinning at me." "Jim was working on the river," Mrs. Lilly added, "and Linda woke me up with a terrible scream. She cried out there was a man in her room. I told her she was dreaming, but she screamed again. He walked around the bed and stood right over me," Linda declared. "I screamed again and hid under the covers. When I looked up again, he was gone. She came running into my room," Mrs. Lilly said. "She said, 'There is a man in my room! There is!' She refused to sleep alone ever since." When we asked for a full description of this man, Linda said she thought he had been wearing a checkered shirt. Occult literature is filled with references to ghosts wearing checkered shirts, but the occultists tend to skip over this seemingly irrelevant detail. Completely unknown to the Lilly family, the man in the checkered shirt had appeared frequently in the home of Mr. and Mrs. George Glines of Pensacola, Florida, starting around 1963. During a hurricane that year, Mr. Glines said, "I was lying on the couch in the living room with just one dim light on. I had the feeling that someone was in the room and looked up and saw a heavily built man about 6 feet tall wearing a plaid sports shirt. I got up and took a couple of steps toward him. As I did, it looked like he took a step backward and disappeared. I turned on the light and he was gone. I checked the doors and they were all locked. I didn't mention it until my son-in-law saw it because I didn't want to upset my wife." The Glines' son-in-law, James Boone, revealed that the man had turned up in his bedroom in the same house. "I saw a large man," he said, "a laboring type person, standing at the foot of the bed. I couldn't see his face. When I started to get up, he went away." Several witnesses heard knockings on the wall of the living room. They finally tore the wall out but could not find anything unusual. George Jr., then only 2 years old, began to talk about his friend Pookie, whom he described as a very big man in a colorful shirt. Mrs. Glines reported that little George told me that he couldn't see Pookie's face. It wasn't clear. Several relatives and friends heard footsteps in the house when there was no one there. In May 1964, the home burned to the ground. "Pookie doesn't like the house all burned," little George told his mother, "but he said he would come back when it was fixed up." Burning houses and mysterious fires go hand in hand with the UFO mystery. The sudden destruction of witnesses' homes has been so frequent that mere coincidence must be ruled out. A contactee in New Mexico, Paul Villa, part Indian, had his little home burned to the ground soon after he released some photographs he had taken of UFOs hovering low over his land. In West Virginia, an abandoned building in the TNT area burned to the ground in the midst of a pouring rain, much to the bewilderment of the local fire department. Grass fires often erupt in empty fields hours or days after a UFO has reportedly touched down there. In some cases, the fires might occur weeks or months before the UFO activity begins, as in the case of Mrs. Bryant, the Ohio woman mentioned earlier. The home of the Jaroslav family at Lake Sinclair, Michigan, was gutted by fire 2 years before Grant Jaroslav and his brother Dan took some controversial UFO photographs over the lake on January 10, 1967. The family continued to live in the basement of the burned-out house, and when UFO investigators later tried to check into the story behind the pictures, they found that the Jaroslavs had changed their unlisted phone number twice and refused to discuss the photos any further. Air Force Major Raymond Nils, operations officer at the nearby Selfridge Air Force Base, told the press, "These are the most amazing flying saucer pictures I've ever seen. You can even make out some sort of tail and antenna on the back." Dr. J. Allen Hynek stated that he thought the pictures were authentic, but the Jaroslavs became incommunicado. Why? What kind of nightmare were they actually living? From Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to the tip of Florida, we have heard of unidentified prowlers roaming the countryside at night. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, strange unearthly faces peered into the windows of homes, windows too high for ordinary men to reach. In 1968, farmers in New York's Delaware County were chasing a giant, broad-shouldered, grinning man with an unruly shock of silver hair. He was over 6 feet tall, and when pursued, he displayed remarkable agility, making impossible leaps across wide ditches. Witnesses, some of whom claimed face-to-face confrontations with him, said he had small eyes and a fixed grin. A similar, if not identical, giant prowler appeared repeatedly in Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1966 and 1967. The most recent case of this type comes from Springdale, Arkansas. At 11 p.m. on September 6, 1969, a man stared into the bedroom window of Mrs. Barbara Robinson. She called police, and Officer Ken Speedland discovered that anyone who looked through the bedroom window would have to have been at least 7 feet tall. There was nothing in the area of the window on which a prowler could have stood. In the spring of 1966, an Air Force WAF returned to her ground floor apartment on the edge of McGuire Air Force Base, New Jersey, one evening and heard a sound in her bedroom. She went to investigate and found her window open and a pair of very pale hands with extraordinarily long fingers resting on the windowsill as if a man were about to climb in. She screamed and the hands withdrew. She found the air police and they searched the area. Later they told her that they had seen and pursued a prowler, a very tall man with his sweater pulled up over his head. This WAF, a master sergeant whom we have known for 15 years, was puzzled by her interest in this sweater detail. We asked her if she had ever seen any monk-like figures, and she recounted an incredible incident which she had almost completely forgotten. Several years before, she had been staying in a motel in New Mexico when she woke up one night to find a giant cowled figure standing over her bed. Not a man in a checkered shirt, but a being in a monk's robe. It extended one arm above her, she said, and she reached out to touch it. The second her fingers touched the arm, the whole thing crumbled and disappeared. "It felt powdery, like ashes," she explained. What have powdery ghosts got to do with flying saucers? Such stories are not uncommon, and in several cases the objects themselves have reportedly disintegrated into powder when struck. On 18th August 1966, a disc-shaped object discharged some pieces of flaming metal directly over some telephone poles near Lyons Lake, New Jersey. The witnesses retrieved some of this substance, which proved to be a honeycombed aluminum-like casting. Although they stored it carefully in a jewel box, it rapidly disintegrated, shrinking to the size of a pea. Since a thorough chemical analysis can cost upwards of $1,000, the metal has never been tested. Large, broad-shouldered men wearing capes and hoods have been seen all over the world, usually walking along desolate roads in thinly populated areas. Like many of the other creatures and characters involved in this mystery, they have an uncanny habit of disappearing without a trace. In October 1967, 3 men were driving along Route 2 in West Virginia when they saw a large caped man walking beside the road. They stopped and looked back, and he was gone. There were open fields on both sides of the road. A group of 8 men wearing thick black cowls startled motorists near Caterham, England on July 28, 1963. Witnesses said that the mystery men departed by running and leaping across the road. Their actions were silent and most odd. Mrs. Jerome Clark sent us the following report in March 1967. I have been told of 2 similar cases in Minnesota. The first incident occurred last April. According to what the witness told me, he and a friend had been driving along the highway about 11:30 p.m. They were miles from the nearest town and they could not see any other cars on the road. Since the land in northwestern Minnesota is very flat, their visibility was almost unlimited. So they were understandably shocked and surprised when in their headlights they caught 3 large men walking abreast and towards them from the other lane of the highway. The men were dressed in black cowls that covered the upper half of their faces. There were slits for eyes. The strangers, whoever or whatever they were, paid no attention to the car and continued on as if it had never passed. The second incident allegedly occurred here in Canby, Minnesota several years ago. An acquaintance of mine was taking a shortcut home through an alley several blocks from where I live. He was not paying any particular attention to the direction he was going and almost walked into another person in the alley. The stranger seemed quite startled and turned to stare in surprise. The man was very tall and massive and was dressed in a black cape that covered the top half of his face. He seemed to be carrying something that resembled a large black bag. Perhaps these are the same kind of entities frequently reported as ghosts around deserted monasteries and seminaries. Certainly if you saw one of these characters stalking through a cemetery and disappearing suddenly into thin air, you would report it as a ghost, if you reported it at all. The Paraphysical Laboratory in Downton, Wiltshire, England, carefully records all of the paranormal and supernatural events in England and issues an annual classified directory of spontaneous phenomena. Their 1968 directory includes many incidents which could be cataloged as either ghost sightings or UFO sightings. For example, on the evening of Saturday, September 21, 1968, Mr. E. Bennett and his 15-year-old daughter were returning to their Whipsnade, Kent home when at the bottom of Bison Hill, a conical-shaped mass rose slowly out from a field about 25 yards in front of them. It was 6 feet tall, they said, with a glowing aura surrounding it, and it seemed to vanish into a solid, impenetrable hedge. Mr. Sidney Webb of Pulham Market, Norfolk, reported that he was walking home along Mill Lane in February 1968 when he saw a tall, luminous shape glide from an entrance in a hedge, travel slowly along the road, and then disappear. It was about half the height of a telephone pole. In Otley, Yorkshire, 4 young girls were taking a shortcut home past a churchyard in January 1968 when a tall, dark shape appeared. Though they were very close to it, they could not discern its face, and despite the frosty weather, no breath came from the figure. One of the girls screamed, but the figure took no notice and walked away with no sound of footsteps. The Church House Inn in Torbrian, Devonshire, is said to be haunted, for a ghost dressed like a monk has been seen there, and all kinds of strange sounds, manifestations, and power failures have taken place there in recent years. In July 1968, 3 schoolboys in Cumberland, England, were camping out when they saw a bright UFO-type light bobbing and weaving over the barren hills of nearby Cumberland Fells. One of the lads, Owen Moran, had a camera and snapped some pictures. When the film was developed, everyone was amazed to find that the object appeared as a pale light resembling the head of a woman in profile, wearing a bonnet or cloak tied under the chin. From Malvern, Arkansas to Mill Lane in Norfolk, strange and inexplicable things have been roaming freely and with a minimum of public notice. They walk through walls and solid hedges, appear and disappear at random and without apparent purpose. Other men in hoods and cloaks stroll the moors of Scotland and the plains of Minnesota, traveling about on mysterious missions in isolated places late at night. Still others step out of unearthly flying objects to chat idly with passing motorists. Who are these people?
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.